The morning Jennie Ralston received the first letter from Cornelius Winslow. She read exactly 3 lines before folding it back into its envelope, pressing the flap shut with the flat of her palm, and walking it straight to the post office in Caldwell, Kansas, where she handed it back to old Silas Dunmore behind the counter and told him to send it right back to wherever it had come from. Silas scratched the back of his sun-leathered neck and looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. "You sure about that, Miss Ralston? Postage ain't cheap, and a letter going back costs the same as one going out." "Then I will pay for it myself," Jennie said, placing 2 coins on the worn wooden counter with a finality that could have driven a fence post into hard ground, and she turned and walked out into the blazing July heat of 1882 without looking back. The town of Caldwell sat right on the Kansas Indian Territory border, and it had a reputation as one of the wildest cattle towns that had ever breathed dust and gunpowder into a summer sky. The Kishom Trail still brought longhorn cattle through in enormous, thundering rivers of hide and horn, and the cowboys who drove them were a rough and restless breed. They drank hard, they laughed loud, and they left in the fall, taking their wages and their broken promises with them. Jennie had watched that cycle for all of her 24 years, and she had made herself a very simple rule. She did not get attached to men who moved with the seasons. Her father, Robert Ralston, had been a merchant, one of the steadier men in Caldwell, and when he had died 2 winters past from a fever that the doctor could do nothing about, he had left Jennie the dry goods store on Main Street and a small house behind the livery, with a good vegetable garden and a stubborn mule named August. Robert Ralston had always said that Jennie had her mother's eyes and his own stubbornness, and he had meant both of those things as compliments. Jennie's mother, Clara, had died when Jennie was 11, taken by the same kind of swift, indifferent sickness that the frontier handed to women with heartbreaking regularity. Jennie had grown up learning to be self-sufficient in the specific way that orphaned daughters of careful men learn, quietly and without complaint, keeping the store ledgers balanced, keeping the shelves stocked, keeping her own counsel. She was not an unhappy woman. She had her friend Martha Good, who ran the millinery shop across the street, and she had her Sunday mornings at the small Methodist church where Reverend Caldwell, no relation to the town's founder, preached sermons that were occasionally inspiring and always mercifully brief. She had her garden, and she had her mule, and she had a small shelf of books that she had read so many times the spines had gone soft as worn leather. She was not unhappy, but she was careful. Cornelius Winslow had come through Caldwell the previous spring, in April of 1882, during one of those warm and deceptive stretches that Kansas offered in April before it remembered it was supposed to still be cold. He had ridden in with a cattle drive from Texas, working as a trail boss for the Langford outfit out of San Antonio, and he had come into Ralston's dry goods 3 days running for supplies, rope, rifle cartridges, flour, dried beans, and the kind of small necessities that a man picks up for his outfit when he has the chance to stand in a real building for a few minutes and breathe air that does not smell entirely of cattle. He was 28 years old, and he was tall in the manner of men who have spent years working on horseback and have consequently developed a kind of lean, angular confidence in their own bodies. He had dark brown hair that the sun had streaked copper at the temples, and gray eyes that were startlingly clear and direct, the kind of eyes that looked at you as if they were actually interested in what you had to say. He wore a well-kept hat and boots that had been good ones once and had been resoled at least twice since, and he had a way of taking his hat off when he came indoors that Jennie noticed because not all men did. The first day he came in, they spoke only about commerce. He needed a specific weight of rope, and she had it, and they settled the transaction with professional courtesy. The second day, he lingered a few minutes longer than was strictly necessary. He asked her if the store had been her family's a long time, and she told him about her father, and he listened in the way that people sometimes do and sometimes only pretend to. He told her he was from a small town outside of Abilene, not the famous Abilene but a smaller, quieter one, and that he had been driving cattle since he was 17 and had worked his way up to trail boss by being reliable and by not drinking during a drive. The third day, he bought a small packet of peppermint candies that she kept in a glass jar on the counter, and he set one on the counter in front of her without making a thing of it, just placed it there and slid it across with one finger, and he said, "I find that a piece of candy in the afternoon makes the rest of the day considerably more bearable, and you look like you have had a long one." She had, as it happened, had a very long day. The Durbin brothers had been in that morning trying to return flour that they had clearly used half of and then dampened to make it look full again, and she had sent them out with a firmness that had cost her more energy than it should have. She looked at the peppermint candy on the counter for a moment, and then she looked at him, and then, against her better judgment, she picked it up and said, "Thank you, Mr. Winslow." He smiled at that, a full, genuine smile, and he put his hat back on and said, "My pleasure, Miss Ralston." The drive moved on the next morning. She did not think about Cornelius Winslow for at least a week, and then she thought about him occasionally for the rest of the summer, and then she told herself firmly that she had stopped thinking about him entirely, which was how she knew she had not. The letter arrived in October, addressed in a careful, deliberate hand, Cornelius Winslow clearly being a man who had worked hard at his penmanship. The envelope was postmarked San Antonio, Texas. She read 3 lines, enough to understand that he had been thinking about her too, enough to feel something warm and complicated move through her chest, and then she folded it back up and sent it back, because that was the sensible thing to do. The second letter came in November. She got slightly further this time, reading perhaps half the page before she caught herself and set it down and breathed and then folded it back and sent it back, because she was not a woman who was going to become entangled with a man who was, at this very moment, over 1,000 miles away in Texas, and would likely as not come through Caldwell the following spring, tip his hat, and then ride on again. The third letter arrived in December, and it was longer. She read the first line on the walk home from the post office, stopped in the middle of the street, read 2 more lines, and then folded it very carefully and put it in her coat pocket and sent it back the next morning without reading any further, and she was very proud of herself for this. Martha Good knew something was happening, because Martha Good knew most things that happened in Jennie Ralston's life, which was the prerogative of best friends. She cornered Jennie at the church social in December, right between the punch bowl and a table loaded with pies, and said, "Silas Dunmore says you have been sending letters back." "Silas Dunmore talks too much," Jennie said. "Who is writing to you?" "Nobody of consequence." Jennie ate a bite of apple pie and looked at the far wall. "A cowboy I met last spring. He passed through with a drive." Martha's eyes went wide with the specific delight of a woman who loves a good romance and suspects one is currently being wasted. "A cowboy is writing you letters from where?" "Texas. He has gone back to Texas." "That is not so far." "It is very far." "What does he say in the letters?" "I do not read them," Jennie said, which was not entirely true, and Martha's expression suggested she knew it. "Ralston, you are the most deliberately difficult person I have ever known, and I say that with great love and considerable frustration." "That is kind of you," Jennie said, and helped herself to another piece of pie. The fourth letter came in January of 1883, and Jennie sent it back without opening it at all. She was very firm about this. The envelope sat on her kitchen table for 2 days before she carried it to the post office, and she kept herself very busy during those 2 days. The fifth letter came in February. She sent it back. The sixth came in March, just as the weather was beginning to think about turning, and she sent that one back too. She noticed, and tried not to notice, that the letters kept coming with a regularity that suggested a man who was not deterred and was not forgetting and was not, in fact, a man who was just writing out of casual courtesy. A casual man would have given up after the second return. A casual man would have taken the hint. Cornelius Winslow, it appeared, was not a casual man. The seventh letter arrived in April, exactly 1 year after he had first walked into her store, and something about that timing, which she could not have said for certain was intentional but which felt very much like it was, made her hold the envelope in her hands for a long time. She carried it home. She set it on the table. She made herself a cup of coffee on the cast iron stove, and she sat down and she looked at the envelope and she told herself she was going to send it back just like all the others. She opened it. She could tell herself later that she had meant to just see what it said, just a quick look, just enough to understand what kind of man persisted in writing 6 returned letters and then sent a 7th. She unfolded the single sheet of paper and she began reading. He wrote without affectation, in plain and honest language. He said that he understood perfectly well why she was sending his letters back, because a woman in her position, running a business alone on the Kansas border, had very good reason not to go attaching herself by correspondence to a man who drove cattle for a living and spent 8 months of the year on the road. He said he was not writing because he expected her to write back. He was writing because he thought about their 3 conversations with a frequency that was honestly starting to interfere with his ability to concentrate on his work, and he had decided that the honest thing to do was to say so, regardless of whether she wanted to hear it. He said he was not a dramatic man, and he was not going to make grand declarations. He said he knew she was careful and that she had good reasons to be careful. He said that she had been the most genuinely interesting person he had spoken to in a long time, not because of anything remarkable she had said, though he had found everything she said interesting, but because of the way she said it, directly and without performance, and because of the way she had looked at him, as if she was actually seeing him rather than just a cowboy passing through, and that he found that very difficult to walk away from. He said he was planning to come through Caldwell again in the spring with the Langford Drive, and he was going to come into her store and buy rope and cartridges and probably those peppermint candies again, and he would like very much to have a proper conversation if she was willing, and if she was not, he would respect that and not write any more letters. He signed it, with sincere regards and considerable hope, Cornelius Winslow. Jennie sat at her kitchen table for a very long time after she finished reading. She did not send that one back. She folded it carefully and put it in the small cedar box where she kept things of value, her mother's cameo brooch, her father's pocket watch, the deed to the store, and she told herself she would decide what to do about it in the morning. In the morning she sat at the table again with her coffee and looked out the window at her vegetable garden, where the early April ground was beginning to soften, and she thought about what it meant to be careful. She had been careful for a long time. Careful had kept her from a great deal of pain, she suspected, but it had also kept her from a great many things. She did not write back, but she did not send the letter back either. He came in the middle of May, which was later than the previous year because the spring had been slow in Texas, and the cattle were behind schedule. She was behind the counter doing the morning accounts when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up. And there he was, with his unresoled boots and his sun-burnished hat and those startlingly gray eyes, and she felt something drop cleanly through the middle of her chest like a stone through still water. "Miss Ralston," he said, and he took his hat off. "Mr. Winslow," she said, and she was very proud of how steady her voice was. "He bought his rope. He bought his cartridges. He bought his flour and his dried beans." He did not mention the letters, and neither did she. But when he placed the last item on the counter and she was writing up his bill, he set something next to the ledger and she looked down and it was a peppermint candy. She looked at it. She looked at him. There was something in his expression that was very carefully controlled and very plainly hopeful, and something about that combination, that effort and that honesty, made something in Jennie Ralston's carefully maintained defenses shift on its foundations. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You did not send it back," he said. He was talking about the letter. His voice was even, not pressing, just observing. "No," she said, "I did not." He nodded slowly, as if she had said something meaningful, which she supposed she had. "I have 3 days before the drive moves on," he said. "I would be glad of your company if you were ever free of an afternoon." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about being careful. She thought about the letter in her cedar box. She thought about the fact that she had read it approximately 11 times in the past month, though she had tried very hard to keep that number lower. "I closed the store at 5 o'clock, she said. Something crossed his face that she would think about for a long time afterward, a quiet and profound relief, like a man who had been holding his breath for a year. "I will be here at 5, he said, and he put his hat back on and picked up his supplies and went out, and the bell rang, and Jennie stood very still behind her counter for about 30 seconds, and then she pressed the backs of both hands to her cheeks because they were very warm. He came at 5 o'clock precisely. He had done what a man can do on a cattle drive to make himself presentable, which was to say he had washed his face and hands, brushed his hat, and put on a clean shirt that had been rolled in his saddlebag, and was consequently creased in interesting diagonal lines. And Jennie found this so entirely endearing that it took her a moment to compose herself when she stepped out the front door of the store and saw him standing on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands. They walked along the main street of Caldwell in the long golden light of a May afternoon, and they talked. They talked the way that people talk when they have been waiting to talk to each other, and both parties are very much aware of this, but are also too sensible to say so directly. He asked her about the store, and she told him about the inventory she had managed to expand, and about the difficulties of ordering from suppliers who were sometimes 2 months out. She asked him about the drive, and he told her about the route from Texas, about the river crossings and the weather and the particular challenge of keeping 800 longhorn cattle moving in the right direction when the cattle had opinions of their own. He was funny, which she had suspected but not confirmed. He had a dry, quiet humor that came out sideways, not in the form of jokes but in the way he described things, and it made her laugh twice in the first 15 minutes, which was 2 more times than most people managed in an hour. They ended up at the small hotel restaurant, which was the most respectable dining establishment in Caldwell, and they had supper together. And by the time the food arrived, the conversation had turned to things that were less careful and more interesting. He told her about growing up outside Abilene, his father who had been a farmer and had hoped Cornelius would be one too, and his own certain, early knowledge that he was not built for staying in one place, which had caused considerable family friction. She told him about her mother, about the books she read, about the particular loneliness of being the only person you could completely rely on, which she had said to very few people before, and which she said now without knowing entirely why. He listened to that last thing with great attentiveness and said, "I think that is a very specific kind of loneliness. I know it some myself." "Do you?" she said. "You seem like a man who is always surrounded by other people." "Being around other people and not being lonely are not the same thing," he said. She thought about that for a moment. "No," she agreed. "They are not." He walked her home afterward to the small house behind the livery, and they stood on her front step in the warm May evening with the sounds of Caldwell settling into its nighttime routines around them, and he said, "I hope you will not mind if I come back tomorrow afternoon." "I think," she said carefully, "that would be acceptable." He came back the next afternoon, and the one after that, and on the third day they walked out past the edge of town to where the prairie opened up, wide and enormous and golden green, stretching to a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. He had brought his horse, a solid bay gelding named Harrison, and he walked with the horse's reins loose in his hand, and Jennie walked beside him, and the wind came across the grass with the warm smell of spring. And there was a moment, somewhere in the middle of an afternoon that felt like it was not subject to ordinary time, when his hand brushed hers as they walked, and neither of them moved away, and his fingers found hers, and they walked like that in silence for a while. She was aware that she was in considerable trouble. The drive left on the 4th morning. He came to the store at 7 o'clock before she opened and knocked on the door, and when she came to it, he was standing there in his trail clothes with his horse saddled behind him. "I did not want to leave without saying so in person," he said. that these past 3 days have meant more to me than anything has in a very long time. To me also, she said, and she was surprised by how clearly and directly she said it, with none of the hedging she had expected from herself. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, folded piece of paper. "I wrote you another letter," he said. "You do not have to keep it, but I wanted you to have it rather than wait for the post." She took it from him. Their fingers touched, and he held on for just a moment before letting go. "I will write properly," he said, "when I get to the end of the drive, if that is acceptable." "It is acceptable," she said. He put his hat on and stepped back, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that were very clear and very direct, and he said, "Take care of yourself, Jennie Ralston." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it like something physical. "You too, Cornelius Winslow," she said. He rode away. She closed the door and stood in the middle of her store in the early morning light and unfolded the small note he had given her, and she read it right then and there, which she had not done with any of the others. It said, "I am not a man who gives his heart easily or carelessly, but I find that it has gone somewhere without my full consent, and I believe you know where. I will not press you for anything you are not ready to give. Only know that I mean everything I have said." She stood there for a long time. Then she went about the business of opening her store, because life continued, and ledgers needed balancing. His proper letter arrived in July, postmarked from Dodge City, where the drive had ended. He described the end of the trail with vivid detail, the noise and the chaos of the stockyards, the relief of getting the cattle counted and the payment settled. He described the city with the eye of a man who has seen enough of cities to appreciate their conveniences and enough of the open country to prefer it. He said he was going back to San Antonio with the Langford outfit for the winter, but that he had been thinking very seriously about something, and he would like to tell her about it if she was willing to correspond. She wrote back. She sat at her kitchen table on a Sunday evening in late July, with the lamp turned up and August the mule making his opinions known from the yard, and she wrote him a letter that she crossed out and rewrote twice before she was satisfied with it. She told him about the store, about the summer in Caldwell, about a small dispute between two neighboring ranchers that had turned into a town controversy. She told him that his note had made her think, and that she had been thinking, and that she would very much like to hear what he wanted to tell her. She was aware, as she sealed the envelope, that she was doing something irreversible. Not the letter specifically, but the acknowledgement contained in it, the acknowledgement that she was paying attention, that she cared what he said, that there was something here worth the risk. His response came in August, and it was the longest letter yet. He told her that he had been considering, for some time, whether trail driving was something he wanted to do for the rest of his life. He had been doing it for 11 years, and he was good at it, but a man of 28 could reasonably ask himself whether being good at something was sufficient reason to keep doing it forever. He said he had some money saved, not a great deal but enough to make a start on something, and that he had been thinking about land. There was good land in Kansas, and in the Indian Territory just south, though the territory brought its own complications that a man needed to think through carefully. He said he was not making any declarations beyond the fact that he was thinking about these things, and that his thinking had been significantly shaped by knowing that Jennie Ralston was in Caldwell, Kansas, and that he would very much like to be less than 1,000 miles away from her. She read that letter 3 times in a row. Then she wrote back the same evening because she did not want to wait. They wrote to each other through the fall and into the winter, 2 letters a month, sometimes 3. He was consistent and honest, never flowery, never falsely romantic, but always genuine in a way that she found herself trusting more and more. He asked her questions about herself that suggested he had been listening carefully to everything she said. He remembered things she had mentioned in passing and returned to them later. He told her about himself in pieces, an honest portrait of a man who had lived a rough life, and had no illusions about it and no apologies for it either. She found herself looking for his handwriting among the post when she went to collect it, and then finding herself annoyed with herself for doing so, and then doing it again anyway. Martha Good was delighted by all of this. "You are smiling differently," Martha told her in September, across the counter of the millinery shop. "You have a new smile." "I do not have a new smile. I have the same smile I have always had." "Your new smile," Martha said serenely, ignoring this completely, "is the smile of a woman who has letters in her cedar box that she did not send back." "You are insufferable," Jennie said. "I am your best friend, which is the same thing. Is he coming back in the spring?" "He has not said yet, but you hope he is." Jennie arranged several bolts of fabric on the shop counter that did not need arranging and said nothing, which was entirely sufficient as an answer. He wrote in November to say that he was not going to go back to San Antonio with the Langford outfit. He had told old Elias Langford that he was done, that he appreciated 11 years of reliable work, but that he was going to try something different. He had purchased, he said, with something he described as a great deal of excitement and a good deal of anxiety, 40 acres of land in southern Kansas, about 30 miles north of Caldwell, with a creek and good grass and a small existing structure that was generously described as a house. He was going to spend the winter in Abilene near his family, and he planned to ride down to his new land in March. He said that if Jennie was willing, he would very much like to come by Caldwell on his way through, and if she was willing beyond that, he would very much like to talk about some things in person. Jennie read this letter twice, then folded it, then unfolded it, then walked twice around her kitchen, then sat back down and read it again. She wrote back and said yes, she was willing, and she would see him in March. She told Martha the next day. Martha's reaction was so enthusiastic that she knocked a hat display off its stand. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a difficult one for Kansas. There were blizzards in January that shut Caldwell down for 3 days, and a sustained cold snap in February that froze the creek solid and made keeping the store warm a significant challenge. Jennie managed it, as she managed most things, with a practical stubbornness that would have made her father proud, but the letters that came through when the post was moving helped considerably. He wrote from Abilene about the cold there too, about the repairs he was making to the family place while he was there, about his younger brother, Daniel, who had married the previous year and had a son and was working their father's land. He described his family with a kind of careful warmth that she recognized as the particular fondness of a man who loves his family and has been away from them a long time. She wrote about the blizzard. She wrote about a dispute she had settled between 2 customers over a wrongly filled order, a dispute that had gotten loud and required her to say very firmly that this was her store and both parties would conduct themselves accordingly or conduct themselves outside, and that had ended the dispute promptly. He wrote back laughing. She could tell, though the letter was perfectly composed, and said that he suspected both parties had felt quite certain they had lost that particular argument before she even finished speaking, and that he meant this as a very great compliment. March came slowly and then all at once, the way Kansas springs always did, with a week of false promise and then a sudden decisive warmth that made the ground soft and the sky large. She had been watching the road south, which she told herself was simply because she looked out her windows in the normal course of the day, and the road south was visible from one of them. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of March, 1884. She was behind the counter, and the bell above the door rang, and this time she knew before she looked up, knew from the sound of his boots on the floorboards, a sound she had heard 3 times in her store and had apparently memorized without meaning to. He looked different and exactly the same. The winter had put some more solidness in his shoulders, and there was something different in his bearing, a settled quality, a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. He had a new hat, she noticed, or at least one that was newer than his previous one. "Miss Ralston," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that had not been quite so apparent the first time he had said it, or perhaps it had always been there and she had not known how to hear it. "Mr. Winslow," she said, "you made it through the winter." "Barely, but yes," he smiled. "You look well." "You do too," she said, and she meant it. He bought supplies because he genuinely needed them, and then he asked if she would have supper with him, and she said yes. And this time when they walked to the hotel restaurant, they did not have to establish the basic facts of themselves with each other because they had been doing that all winter in ink, and they could talk about things that were a step deeper. Over supper, he told her about the land. The house needed significant work, he said, and he was prepared for that. The land itself was good, the grass was reliable, the creek ran clean. He was planning to run some cattle, not a large operation to start, but something honest and manageable. He had enough money to get through the first year if he was careful. "I wanted to tell you something," he said, when they had been talking for a while and the restaurant had emptied out around them until they were the last two people in it. "I suspected you might," she said. He looked at her directly with those gray eyes. "I am 30 years old. I have spent most of my adult life moving and I have not minded it, but I mind it now. I want to be somewhere. I want to put something down and watch it grow." He paused. "I want a life, Jenny, not just an occupation." She waited because she could tell he had more to say. "I know this is not a conventional way to come at this," he said. "We have not spent a great deal of time in the same place, but I think we have been honest with each other over these months, and I know my own mind, and I believe I know something of yours, though you are welcome to correct me." He took a breath. "I would like very much to court you properly, if that is something you are willing to consider." The word properly was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and she understood exactly what he meant by it, which was that he was not suggesting anything casual or temporary. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the letters. She thought about the ones she had sent back and the ones she had kept, and the way she had felt reading each of them. She thought about 3 days in May and 2 hours on the open prairie with his hand in hers and the wind in the grass. She thought about being careful, and about the particular loneliness of being the only person you completely rely on, and about what he had said, that being around people and not being lonely were not the same thing. "Yes," she said, "I am willing to consider that." He was not a demonstrative man in public, but something moved across his face then that she thought she might carry with her for the rest of her life, a quiet and deep relief and gladness, very genuine, not performed. "Good," he said, and then said nothing else for a moment because perhaps there was nothing else that needed saying right then. He rode out to his land the next morning. It was 30 miles north, and he planned to spend the week there beginning the spring work, and then he said he would come back to Caldwell on Saturday if she would allow it. She said she would allow it. She watched him ride north on his bay horse Harrison through the window of the store, and Martha appeared in her doorway across the street like magic because Martha had been watching. "Well," Martha called across. Jenny turned and looked at her friend. "He is courting me properly," she said. Martha's response was loud enough that 3 people on the boardwalk turned to look. "He came back on Saturday, and then the following Saturday." He fell into a pattern of working his land through the week and coming to Caldwell on weekends, and this continued through the spring of 1884. He would come in on Saturday afternoon and they would have supper together, and sometimes he would stay for church on Sunday, and they would take long walks on Sunday afternoons, along the creek south of town or out onto the prairie where the wildflowers were coming in, and the meadowlarks were doing their particular business in the long grass. She began to let herself enjoy it, which was perhaps the most daring thing she did. She stopped waiting for something to go wrong. She stopped managing her feelings from a distance and just let herself be glad when she saw him and honest about why. He was building something on his land, very literally. The original structure had been sound in its bones but required a proper floor and a second room and a real fireplace, rather than the inadequate hole in the wall that had served that function previously. He talked about it when they walked, describing the progress, the difficulties, the solutions. He had hired 2 men from Caldwell to help with the heavy carpentry, brothers named Paxton who were reliable and reasonably priced. She listened with genuine interest, because it was not abstract to her anymore. She had ridden out to see it once in April, with Martha as a chaperone because appearances mattered in a town like Caldwell, and she had a business to consider. And she had stood in the half-finished second room and looked out the window at the creek and the grass, and thought about things she was not ready yet to say out loud. In June he asked her father's permission, and then remembered that her father was dead, and stood for a moment looking at the floor of her store with an expression of a man recalibrating, and then looked up and said, "Is there anyone I should speak to?" "You should speak to me," she said, with a clarity she was rather pleased with. He looked at her. He smiled. "And I am asking you," he said, "will you marry me, Jennie Ralston?" She had known it was coming. She had known for at least 3 weeks that it was coming, and she had thought about what she would say, and she had thought about it carefully, and she had thought about the letters and the peppermint candy and the gray eyes and the hand in hers on the prairie. And when he said it, standing in her store in the afternoon light with the whole summer coming through the windows, she felt absolutely no need for careful deliberation at all. "Yes," she said, "I will." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took both her hands in his and held them, and he looked at her the way she had been looking at him for a year, and had tried very hard not to show, and she looked right back and let herself be seen. They were married in August of 1884 in the small Methodist church in Caldwell, with Reverend Caldwell presiding and Martha Good crying very happily in the front pew, and Daniel Winslow, Cornelius's brother, making the trip up from Abilene with his wife and young son, and a good portion of Caldwell in attendance because Jennie Ralston was known and respected in that town, and a number of people were genuinely glad to see her happy. She wore a dress of pale blue cotton that she had made by the dressmaker on the south end of Main Street, and she carried flowers from her own garden, which seemed right. He wore a dark coat that was new and boots that were resoled and a good hat, and he stood at the front of the church looking at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that Reverend Caldwell later described to his wife as one of the most straightforwardly besotted looks I have ever had occasion to witness, which the Reverend's wife said was a lovely thing. After the wedding, the town threw them a modest celebration in the church hall, with dancing and food and considerable quantities of good feeling, and when they finally left, it was in Cornelius's wagon heading north under the wide Kansas night sky, with the stars very close and bright and the prairie dark and enormous around them. She had sold the store. This had been a very difficult decision, and had taken her several weeks of genuine anguish, because the store was her father's and her independence and the thing she had built, and selling it felt like setting down something she had been holding for a long time. Cornelius had never once suggested she sell it. He had said very clearly that it was her store and her decision, and that he would support whatever she decided. She had decided, finally, that she did not want to drive 60 miles round trip to manage a store, and that she could let it go while still being the person who had run it, and that her father, who had always said her stubbornness and her mother's eyes were both compliments, would probably have understood. She had sold it to young Henry Briggs, who was 22 and had been working at the feed store and had wanted a shop of his own, and she had sold it for a fair price and spent 2 full days explaining the accounting system and the supplier relationships, and which customers required careful watching, and she had walked out of it on the last afternoon with her ledger books under her arm and felt something that was sad and right and forward-moving all at once. The house on Cornelius's land, her land now, their land, was finished by the time of the wedding. The Paxton brothers had done good work. The floors were sound, the fireplace drew properly, the second room was large and bright with good windows, and there was a small porch at the front facing the creek where the evening light was very beautiful in a way that made you want to sit there and not say anything in particular. She learned the rhythms of the place through that first fall, the way the creek rose and fell, the way the wind came from the west in the afternoon, the particular quality of Kansas light in September when it went long and gold and made everything look like a painting of itself. She planted a vegetable garden behind the house, larger than the one in town, and she got 2 chickens and named them with the pragmatic practicality of a woman who knew better than to name chickens, and then named them anyway. Cornelius ran his small cattle operation with the same reliability that had made him a good trail boss, methodical and patient and not reckless. He had 15 head to start, and he planned to expand carefully, which was the right way to do it. He hired on a hand for the busiest months, a young man of about 20 named Sam Rays, who was a hard worker and unfailingly polite, and had a way with the cattle that suggested he had been around them all his life, which he had, his family having come north from Texas a decade before. The injustices of the frontier were not abstract things in that part of Kansas. Sam Rays had grown up knowing what it was to be looked at with suspicion in every town he passed through, to be assumed a troublemaker before he had opened his mouth, to be turned away from establishments that served men with lighter skin without difficulty. Cornelius had hired him on the basis of a recommendation and his own observation, and he made it very clear to anyone who commented that his ranch was not a place where that kind of thing would be entertained. Jennie agreed with this completely and said so, and Sam, who was a reserved young man not given to much personal expression, thanked them both quietly once, and that was the end of it, though she thought she saw in his eyes something of the particular relief of a man who has been treated fairly in a world that does not always extend that courtesy. The territory to the south was Indian Territory, the land that the federal government had assigned to the 5 civilized tribes and others, and the complications around its borders were very real. There were debates in the newspapers about opening the territory to settlement, which some white settlers supported loudly, and the tribes opposed with equal force and considerably more justification, having already been relocated there at enormous cost. Jennie followed these debates with a thoughtful attention and a clear moral sense that had always been part of her character, the same quality that had made her good at running a fair store and had made the Durbin Brothers flour scheme so intolerable to her. Through the fall, she and Cornelius worked out the comfortable geometry of 2 people building a life together. He was an early riser, which she was too, and they fell into the habit of having coffee together on the porch in the early morning before the work of the day separated them. He was quiet in the mornings in a way that she did not find troublesome, because she was also quiet in the mornings, and there was something very easy about being quiet with someone who did not require you to fill the silence. He was attentive in small ways that accumulated. He noticed when she was tired and said so, without making her feel managed. He remembered which problems she was working on and asked about them with genuine interest. He had an opinion about most things but did not press it when she disagreed, which she did, because she had her own opinions and always had, and he genuinely seemed to like this about her rather than finding it challenging. She discovered that she was genuinely happy, not in the dramatic way of stories, not in a way that required constant acknowledgement, but in the deep and quiet way of a life that fits, like a good pair of boots that have been worn long enough to match the shape of your feet. In November, she told him she was going to have a baby. She told him in the kitchen after supper, with the lamp turned up and the fire going and the November wind coming across the prairie, and she watched his face move through a sequence of expressions that she had not quite anticipated, and which included, in order, surprise, a kind of stunned joy, and then a very unself-conscious smile that was one of the largest she had ever seen on him. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with a gentleness that she felt in her bones, and he said, very quietly against her hair, "Jennie, that is the best thing anyone has ever told me." "I suspect it is the best thing I have ever told anyone," she said, and felt his laugh, warm and low, against her cheek. The baby came in the summer of 1885 in June, with the whole great Kansas summer opening up around them. Martha Good came up from Caldwell, because Jennie had asked her, and because Martha would have come without being asked, and she brought the Caldwell doctor with her, a reliable man named Hooper who had delivered approximately 100 babies in his career. Cornelius waited on the porch through the long afternoon and into the evening with a controlled anxiety that even Sam Rays, who was not particularly given to domestic notice, observed and quietly respected. When Dr. Hooper came to the porch door and told him he had a son, Cornelius stood up very quickly and then held very still for a moment, the way people sometimes do when they receive news that is too large to respond to with ordinary movement, and then said, "Jennie, is she well?" "She is very well," the doctor said. "Strong woman, your wife." He knew that already, but he went inside and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Jennie, who was tired in the specific radiant way of women who have just done something enormous and are quite aware of it. And she was holding a very small and thoroughly opinionated person with a great deal of dark hair, and Cornelius looked at both of them, and his face was not controlled at all for a moment. They named the boy Robert, for Jennie's father, with James as a middle name for Cornelius's father, who had died during the winter before the wedding, and whom Cornelius had mourned with the quiet steadiness he brought to most things. Robert James Winslow came into the world in June of 1885 and immediately made his presence felt in the house in the specific ways that infants do, which is to say constantly. The years that followed were busy and good. The ranch grew steadily. Cornelius was careful with his money and thoughtful about expansion, adding 10 head here and 15 there, always keeping what he had healthy before he added more. Sam Rays stayed on, earning a full wage and a proper arrangement, and turned out to be an excellent stockman who had ideas about cattle management that were worth listening to, and Cornelius listened. They built a proper bunkhouse for Sam and any additional hands, because it was the right thing to do, and because Cornelius ran his place the way he believed a place should be run. Jennie kept the household accounts and helped with the books for the ranch, which turned out to be something she was very good at, and which Cornelius was grateful for because he was good at cattle and land, but found the paperwork honestly tedious. She also kept up her letter writing, because she had discovered during that long winter of correspondence that she liked writing and was good at it, and she began corresponding with several women she had met through church connections and through Martha, sharing observations and opinions and news in the lively and intelligent prose that Cornelius, who occasionally read her letters before she sealed them, and with her full knowledge, said was the best writing he encountered outside of books. Martha Good came up to visit several times a year and was an enthusiastic presence in the house, spoiling Robert extravagantly and keeping Jennie fully informed about everything that was happening in Caldwell, which was a considerable amount because Caldwell continued to be the kind of town where things happened. Robert grew from an opinionated infant into an opinionated toddler, which his father found entirely entertaining, and his mother found entirely familiar, since she recognized the quality as one she had contributed to the genetic inheritance. He had Cornelius's gray eyes and Jennie's dark hair, and seemed to have collected the stubbornness of both of them, which Jennie pointed out would either be a tremendous asset or a significant challenge, and Cornelius said it would almost certainly be both. In the fall of 1887, they had a daughter. They named her Clara, for Jennie's mother, and she came into the world on an October morning when the Kansas sky was high and very blue, and the cottonwoods along the creek were going gold, and she had red hair that appeared to be entirely her own business and not attributable to either parent, which Cornelius said must have skipped from somewhere back in the family and was welcome regardless of its origins. Clara was a quieter child than Robert, more watchful and deliberate, though she had her moments of absolute determination that reminded Jennie very much of herself at that age. Life on the ranch in those years was not without its difficulties. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was one of the worst in memory, a brutal cold that killed cattle across the plains in shocking numbers and set back a great many ranching operations. Cornelius lost 8 head, which was painful but survivable because he had been careful and had some reserves, and because Jennie's contribution to the household finances meant they were not caught dangerously short. They got through it and rebuilt, and the following summer was good enough that by fall they had recovered most of what they had lost. There were prairie fires, which were the terrifying reality of life on the Kansas grasslands, and there were stretches of drought that made the creek run low and the grass thin, and there were the ordinary accumulated difficulties of running land and animals and a household at the edge of the frontier. None of it was easy. All of it was manageable, because they managed it together. Caldwell's wildness was diminishing through the late 1880s. The cattle drives were slowing as the railroads pushed further south and west, and the famous rowdiness of the trail town was giving way to something more settled and permanent. Jennie watched this with mixed feelings when she went into town, because she had grown up in the chaos and energy of it, and there was something in the settling that felt like the end of one kind of story, even if it was the beginning of another. She and Cornelius came into Caldwell perhaps once a month, for supplies and church, and to see Martha, and to maintain the connections that keep a person grounded in the human world. Reverend Caldwell had been replaced by a younger minister named Hughes, who preached longer sermons and was less theologically flexible. But Jennie had a practical relationship with the church that did not require her to agree with everything from the pulpit. In the spring of 1889, a great deal of attention turned to the land run in Indian Territory. The federal government had decided to open the unassigned lands in the heart of the territory to white settlers, and the news was everywhere, in the newspapers, and in the conversations of every man and woman on the border. Jennie found herself deeply conflicted about it, as she had always been about the territory and its politics. The unassigned lands had been taken back by the government from tribes who had themselves been relocated there after the removal from their original homelands, and the moral ledger on this transaction seemed to her very straightforwardly terrible. Cornelius agreed. He had no interest in the land run himself, having good land of his own, but he had opinions about the fairness of the arrangement that aligned with Jennie's, expressed in his characteristically direct way. Taking land from people who were told it was theirs when they were pushed off the land before that, he said one evening, is not something I can call progress, no matter what the newspapers say. Neither can I, Jennie said, and they agreed on this as they agreed on most things of moral substance, without fanfare or complexity, just a shared clear seeing. Sam Rays, who had family connections in the territory, and understood its complicated human geography in a way that Jennie and Cornelius could only glimpse from the outside, said nothing about the land run except once, quietly, that he hoped the people who had lived there knew what was coming, which Jennie thought was the most restrained and dignified way possible of expressing something that must have been considerably more felt than that. That summer, Robert was 4 years old and already following his father around the ranch with a seriousness of purpose that was very funny to watch and very obvious in its trajectory. Clara was nearly 2 and had opinions about everything, which she expressed clearly and without ambiguity in the manner of her mother before she had the vocabulary to be subtle about it. Cornelius watched his children with an attention that Jennie noticed and loved. He was not a demonstrative father in the way of men who make theatrical performances of their affection, but he was present in the daily sense, genuinely present, which was worth considerably more. He taught Robert about horses with the patience of a man who has spent years managing animals and understands that patience is the whole of it. He held Clara when she was fussy in the evenings and walked the porch with her until she settled, which she did more readily for him than for anyone else, which Jennie said was either because of some particular affinity or because his voice was so deep, and even that it was essentially the human equivalent of a rocking chair. Cornelius thought this was very funny and told her so. The letters, which had begun the whole thing, never entirely stopped. Jennie still wrote to Martha, and to Daniel Winslow's wife in Abilene, and to several other women she knew through various connections. Cornelius, who had been such a diligent letter writer for the better part of a year, now had the writer of those letters in his own house and did not need to use paper. But Jennie occasionally found on the kitchen table a small folded note with her name on it, written in his careful hand, that said something brief and direct and true. After one particularly difficult week in the fall of 1888, when a fence problem had consumed 3 days of work, and then a supplier had shorted their order, and then Robert had a fever that kept everyone awake for 2 nights before it broke, she had found a note on the table that said, "I know this week has been hard. I want you to know I see how you hold everything together. I am very glad every day that you did not send back that last letter." She had sat down at the kitchen table and laughed, and then, alone in the kitchen, she had let her eyes go wet for a moment because it had been a hard week and she was tired, and the note was very much the right thing. She kept that note in the cedar box. It was in there with the first letters, the ones she had not sent back, and her mother's cameo and her father's watch, which was the company it deserved. In the early years of the new decade, the 1890s, the ranch had grown into something genuinely solid. They had 60 head of cattle by 1891, which was managed responsibly and produced a reliable income. Sam Rays had become, over the years, less a hired hand and more an essential part of the operation, a man who understood the land and the animals and his employers, and had built a life for himself on the property that was stable and dignified, which was what he had always deserved. Sam had married in 1890, a quiet woman named Esperanza whom he had met through family connections in the area, and Jennie and Cornelius had been glad for them both and had done what they could to make the arrangement a workable one, which included building a better house on the property for the couple. Esperanza was a capable woman and a good neighbor, and she and Jennie developed a warm working friendship over the shared concerns of household management and the particular female solidarity of women in a place where there were not always enough of them. Robert started school in Caldwell in 1892, which required a boarding arrangement during the week with a family there, a solution they arrived at after considerable discussion and some parental anxiety, because Caldwell was a long day's ride from the ranch and they could not make it daily. He was 7 years old and already serious about things that interested him and uninterested in things that did not, and he adapted to school with the determination of a child who has decided to master something. He came home on weekends and Cornelius took him out with the horses and cattle, and the two of them in the corral on a Saturday morning were one of Jennie's favorite things to watch from the porch. Clara started at 5, when a small schoolhouse was established closer to their area, which made the logistics easier. She was a sharp reader from very early, which Jennie attributed to the books she had read aloud to both children from infancy, and she had a mathematical mind that Clara had clearly gotten from the combination of Jennie's bookkeeping and whatever numerical facility ran through the Winslow side. The years accumulated. Jennie and Cornelius were in their mid-30s, and they were not young in the way they had been, but they were not old in the way that hard frontier life sometimes made people old before their time. They were healthy and busy, and their marriage had the comfortable weight of something that has been tested and has held. They still took their Sunday afternoon walks when weather and circumstance allowed, usually along the creek, sometimes out onto the open prairie that still rolled enormous and magnificent to the horizon. They still had their coffee on the porch in the mornings. They still talked, really talked, about the things that mattered and the things that did not but were interesting anyway, and Jennie thought sometimes that this was the most underrated thing about a good marriage, the conversation, the simple ongoing conversation of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds. He still, occasionally, read to her in the evenings. This had started in their first winter on the ranch, when the nights were long and the wind was loud, and she had pulled a book from her small collection, and he had said he would read it if she liked, and his reading voice had turned out to be excellent, low and even and careful. They had worked through most of her original collection and had added to it over the years, ordering from a bookshop in Wichita that had a good catalog, and these evenings were a particular pleasure that neither of them would have given up for anything. In 1893, a third child came, another boy, whom they named after his father's family but called Will from the start, because Cornelius was already a full name to live up to, and a child of 8 should not be required to manage it. Will was a different kind of child from either Robert or Clara, easier and sunnier and more adaptable, with Cornelius's gray eyes and something in the way he laughed that was entirely his own, and the household, which had found its rhythms around 2 children, adjusted to 3, with the elastic competence of a family that knows how to absorb change. Martha Good had married, finally and triumphantly, in 1891, a widower named George Ames, who ran the hardware store and had been pursuing Martha with a dedicated patience that Jennie found admirable, and that Martha had described as both touching and extremely annoying before she decided it was mostly touching. Martha was, if anything, more herself in the context of a marriage, which was to say she was very happy and very much Martha, and she and George had a cheerful and energetic household and 2 stepchildren from his first marriage who had accepted Martha with the same eventually won devotion that George had displayed. Jennie and Martha's friendship, which had sustained them both through the harder parts of their respective lives, continued with the same fundamental quality it had always had, which was to say it was honest and warm and occasionally exasperating in the best possible way. They wrote to each other when they were not in the same place, which was another form of correspondence that Jennie valued, the female friendship letters that documented the texture of daily life in a way that preserved it and also made it, in the telling, more vivid and meaningful. The years were not without their losses. Daniel Winslow's wife passed away in 1895 from a long illness, leaving Daniel with his son and the farm, and Cornelius went to Abilene for 2 weeks to be with his brother, and returned quieter than usual and older in some indefinable way that grief puts into a person. Jennie held him through it in the practical and tender way that good marriages allow, and by the end of the year he had come back to himself, though she thought he was never quite the same about the fragility of things, which was a kind of knowledge that changed a person permanently. Old Silas Dunmore, who had manned the Caldwell post office and had known about every letter that came and went, and had given Jennie a certain look every time she handed back a Cornelius Winslow envelope, died in 1896 at the age of 73, after a good long life of knowing other people's business. Jennie went to his funeral and thought with some private fondness about those winter mornings when she had come to his counter with her firmly shut-again envelopes and his raised eyebrow above his spectacles. By the late 1890s, the frontier as Jennie had grown up understanding it was genuinely passing. The cattle drives were essentially finished. The great open ranges were being fenced. Kansas was more settled, more institutionalized. The wildness that had given Caldwell its particular character smoothed away into something more ordinary. It was progress in some ways and a loss in others, which was how progress tended to work. Robert was 16 in 1901, and he was becoming a man in ways that were both gratifying and disconcerting to watch, as children becoming adults tends to be. He had his father's directness and his mother's stubbornness, and he had decided he wanted to study engineering, which had surprised Jennie for about 20 minutes before she recognized it as the entirely logical extension of a child who had grown up watching things built and had always wanted to understand how they worked. There was a state college in Manhattan, Kansas, that was a realistic possibility, and the family began thinking about what that would require. Clara, at 14, was in all honesty the most academically gifted of the three children, though Jennie was careful not to say this in any way that would cause family disharmony. She read constantly and broadly, and had recently developed a particular interest in botany, which had been inspired by a library book that Robert had brought back from school as the sort of careless gift that older siblings sometimes give without knowing they have done something significant. Clara spent a remarkable amount of time in the fields and along the creek cataloging plants in a small notebook that she kept with serious scientific attention. Will, at 8, was the social one, the child who knew everyone and was known by everyone, who could charm a new acquaintance in 5 minutes, and had never in his life passed a dog without stopping to make its acquaintance. He was going to be fine regardless of what he ended up doing, because he had the particular human quality of being genuinely likable, not in the calculated way but in the natural way, and that went a long way in any direction. Cornelius, who was 45 in 1899 and who had spent 30 years on horseback in one form or another, was beginning to feel the accumulated effects of that in the way that a body honestly communicates when it has been put to considerable use. There was a stiffness in his joints in cold weather that he ignored as long as he could and managed when he could not. He had not lost his pleasure in the work. He still went out every morning with a satisfaction in the physical labor of it that had been consistent through his entire adult life. But he was more careful, and he took on less of the heaviest work. And Sam Rays, who was 30-something, and at the peak of his capability, carried more of the physical load without it needing to be explicitly negotiated. Jennie watched this transition with a mix of feelings that she managed in her characteristic way, by acknowledging them clearly and then getting on with what was needed. She was not afraid of her husband getting older because she was getting older too, and because aging in the company of someone you love is very different from aging alone. She was 41 in 1901, and she had lines at the corners of her eyes that she had earned, and her dark hair had silver threads in it that she did not attempt to disguise, and she felt, when she thought about it, which was not very often because she was a busy woman, that she looked like herself, and that herself was a person she did not mind very much being. He still left notes on the kitchen table. The most recent one, left on a morning in October when she had been up half the night with Will, who had a chest cold, had said, "You have been the best part of every year I have lived since the spring of 1882, and I find that number is adding up to something very fine." She was still keeping them in the cedar box, which was becoming rather full. The house had been expanded twice by 1900, a proper kitchen addition in 1890 and a full second floor in 1898, which the family had needed badly by that point, and which the Paxton brothers, who were now middle-aged and had a proper carpentry business, had built with their customary competence. The porch at the front had been extended so it ran the length of the house, and there were 2 rocking chairs on it that had been a gift from Martha and George, solid and comfortable chairs that got consistent use. The vegetable garden behind the house had expanded significantly over the years. Jennie ran it with the same organized attention she had given to the store ledgers, keeping records of what she planted and where and how it performed, rotating crops in the way she had read about, and in the way Esperanza had taught her from her own family's knowledge. She traded produce with Esperanza and with a neighboring farm woman named Helen Crawford, and the surplus went to Caldwell with them on their monthly trips, where it was reliably sold or traded. The chickens had proliferated. There were 12 of them now. She had stopped naming them after the first 2, though the current rooster was called Governor, because he had a manner about him that made this unavoidable. In the spring of 1902, Robert left for the State College in Manhattan, Kansas, and the family drove him to Caldwell to catch the train, which had arrived in Caldwell some years earlier and had changed the logistics of everything. Robert was 17 and large for his age, with his mother's coloring and his father's build, and he handled his leave-taking with a determined composure that lasted until he hugged his mother, at which point his composure needed some brief maintenance. Cornelius shook his son's hand and then pulled him into a brief, hard embrace and said something close to his ear that Jennie did not hear, and Robert nodded seriously. And then he got on the train, and the three of them, Jennie and Cornelius and Will, who was 9 and extremely interested in the train machinery, watched it pull away from the station. "He will be fine," Cornelius said, standing beside her on the platform. "Of course he will," Jennie said. "He has your stubbornness and mine, which is frankly in excess of it, but he will be fine." "He has your stubbornness," Cornelius said. "Mine is much more moderate." She looked at him with an expression she had been perfecting for 20 years. He smiled. "I stand by that characterization," he said, and she took his arm as they walked off the platform, and she laughed, and it was a good morning regardless of the complicated feelings in it. Clara took Robert's departure as an opportunity to claim his bookshelf for her own plant specimens, which was the kind of practical opportunism that Jennie recognized and respected. She was 15 in 1902 and had the particular quality of young women who have always been surrounded by books and ideas, which is to say she was quietly formidable, and most people did not realize it until she had already made her point. The ranch was genuinely profitable by 1902. Not wealthy in the way of the great cattle empires, which had mostly collapsed under their own unsustainability anyway, but solidly, responsibly profitable, which was exactly what Cornelius had always aimed for. He had 80 head of quality cattle, good land with a reliable water source, a well-maintained property, and a working arrangement with Sam Rays that had benefited both parties for nearly 20 years. He talked sometimes in the evenings about what would happen to the land eventually, which was the kind of conversation that people begin to have when they are in their 40s and have built something that they expect to outlast them. He thought Robert might want it one day, or part of it. He thought Will had a different nature but might surprise them. He wondered about Clara, who was clearly going to pursue something academic and would probably not stay in southern Kansas, though he said this with pride rather than regret. Jennie listened to these conversations and contributed to them, and she thought, though she did not always say it, that the most important thing they had built was not the land or the cattle or the house. The most important thing they had built was Robert and Clara and Will, 3 people who were themselves, fully themselves, confident and curious and capable, and who would go out into the world and make it somewhat better than they had found it, which was all any parent could honestly hope for. She thought about this on the porch sometimes, in the evenings when Cornelius was reading and Will was doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table, and Clara was in the field with her notebook, and the light was going long and golden across the prairie, and the creek was making its quiet noise, and the whole enormous Kansas sky was doing its evening thing. She had been very careful once. She had kept her distance from things that might hurt her, from men who moved with the seasons, from attachments that required her to depend on someone else. She had built her walls with considerable skill. And then a man with gray eyes and honest handwriting had sent her letter after letter, until she finally read one that she could not send back. And she had packed her bags. She thought about the bags she had packed. 1 trunk and 1 carpet bag, which was everything she had brought from the house behind the livery to this ranch on a warm August evening in 1884 when the prairie was dark and enormous, and the stars were very close. She had stood in the bedroom of the almost finished house that first night and set her carpet bag on the new floor, and she had looked around at the space that was going to be her home, and she had felt something that she could only describe as rightness, a sense of arriving somewhere that had been waiting for her. She had not been wrong. Cornelius came out to the porch and lowered himself into his rocking chair with the careful movement of a man whose joints are reminding him of his history. He had a cup of coffee, which he should not have been drinking at this hour but which he persisted in anyway, and a book he had been reading for a week and was almost finished with, and he glanced at her when he sat down. "You are thinking about something," he said. "I usually am," she said. Something specific. She looked at him. In the evening light, with the silver in his hair and the lines of his face that 20 years of weather and work and living had put there, he was very familiar and very dear, and she had the sharp, grateful awareness of this that came to her sometimes without warning. "I was thinking about the letter," she said. He did not need to ask which one. He knew. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the creek and the golden grass, and then he said, "I almost did not write that one. I had sent 6 back. A reasonable man might have taken the hint." "You are generally a reasonable man," she said. "I was not being reasonable," he said. "I was being persistent." "I know," she paused. "I am very glad you were." He reached across the space between the rocking chairs and found her hand, and he held it in the loose and comfortable way of two people who have been holding each other's hands for a long time, and he said, "So am I." The evening settled around them. Will came out briefly to announce some piece of schoolwork news and then went back inside. Clara came across the field from the creek with her notebook and mud on her boots and paused on the porch steps to show them something she had found, a particular kind of grass she had not documented before, and she was so genuinely excited about it that it was impossible not to share the excitement. And she went inside with her notes and her specimen and her unself-conscious enthusiasm. Cornelius and Jennie sat on the porch in the failing light, holding hands in the easy way of people who have earned this particular ease, and the prairie stretched away enormous and indifferent and beautiful in every direction, and the creek ran, and the stars came out, one by one, and then all at once. She thought about writing a letter to Martha tomorrow, about Clara and the grass, and about Robert in his college, and about the evening on the porch with the stars coming out. She thought Martha would like that. Martha always liked the good things, and there were, she thought, such a remarkable number of them. She leaned her head back against the rocking chair and breathed the night air that smelled of grass and water and the particular clean smell of the Kansas sky. And she was, in the deep and full and undramatic way that means it most, very happy. The last letter she had ever received from Cornelius Winslow was in the cedar box, in the house behind her, next to her mother's cameo and her father's watch, and a small folded note that said, "I know this week has been hard," and another that said, "You have been the best part of every year," and several others in the same careful, direct hand that she had learned to read as fluently as she read her own thoughts. She had sent back 7 letters and kept one, and then she had packed her bags, and the life she had arrived at was one she would not have traded for anything the world had to offer. 20 years of mornings with coffee on the porch. 20 years of that careful, clear voice that told her the truth without ornamentation. 20 years of gray eyes that were genuinely interested in what she had to say. 20 years of a hand in hers on the prairie and notes on the kitchen table, and someone to be quiet with in the mornings when the day had not yet started, and the world was still soft. The stars were very bright and numerous, as they always were out here away from the town lights, spread across the enormous Kansas sky in the profligate way of something that does not know what scarcity is. She had looked at this sky for 20 years, and it still made her feel the particular and necessary smallness of being a person under a very large sky, which was not a diminishment but an orientation. Cornelius finished his coffee and set the cup down on the porch railing and opened his book, which he could barely read in the dimming light but would try for another few minutes before the light gave out entirely. She watched him try and smiled to herself, and thought about the peppermint candy on the counter, and the way he had said her name for the first time, and the wagon ride north under these same stars, and all the accumulated small and large things that had made up the substance of a life built together. She reached over and gently pushed his book down just enough to look at him, and when he met her eyes with a questioning expression, she said simply, "I love you, Cornelius Winslow." He had heard this from her for 20 years. He looked at her the same way he always had when she said it, as if it was the first time and he was still surprised by his luck, and he said, "I love you too, Jennie Winslow," And there was nothing in those words that was diminished by repetition, nothing at all. He went back to his book. She went back to the stars. Will called good night from inside the house. The creek ran. The grass moved in the warm night wind. The cedar box was full. And the porch was large enough for 2 rocking chairs, side by side, and there were long years ahead still. She was sure of it. Long and good years with more letters and more mornings and more evenings like this one, and more children eventually becoming more of themselves, and more life doing what life does when it is given room and care, and 2 people who have decided to build it honestly and together. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.